Brilliant, thanks. I really enjoyed that. I know we're competitors, but it was really interesting to see, yeah, what Dominic was talking about and how it matches a lot of things that we have in our own, similar approach. But I want to talk about something different. It's going to cover some similar areas, especially things that you guys were chatting about there towards the end. So, well, I don't know, a few years ago, 3 years ago, our local software architecture meetup was having their 10-year anniversary. And one of the organizers came to me and said, "Hey, you're getting pretty old. Can you come and talk about the kind of architecture that you've been working on? Tell us about all the different types and the career path." Because we have a lot of people that are just starting off or have been there for a while and they're curious. And I thought, well, I can't imagine people are really interested, but I'll give it a go. Talk about the different kinds of systems that are built over the years. And I was surprised how well it was received and the positive feedback. And I think it was because, as I said, there's lots of people earlier in their career and they see these different roles in an organization and they only see aspects of them. They don't see all of it and they're curious to know what it's about. They're usually very opinionated about what's right and what's wrong with those roles. And it's good to get in a conversation about them. But also because we don't often get a chance to step back and have a think about what we do, and especially how we think about what we do in terms of a career. So I want to talk about that today. I want to talk about different types of design. I don't want to talk about what's the difference between a business architect and an enterprise architect and a solution architect. I want to talk about different types of actual design. And I've been in teams that have built single applications and teams that have built solutions across an entire enterprise and teams that have, done, how do you implement a merger and acquisition across a multinational company? Massive transformations and small solutions. And it's been interesting to think about what's similar and what's different about all those types of architecture, because normally when we talk about it, we have a really simple view of what architecture is. We all participate. Everyone here who's participating in this conference, I would say they're passionate about what they do. That's why they're using their time to come here today and to learn. And they're on Twitter and they're reading blogs and they're communicating on LinkedIn with extremely strong opinions about what architecture is. And I found that a lot of what I read, because I want to learn, constantly learn about how I can get better at what I do. And a lot of what you read is very useful, but a surprising amount of what you read is disparaging about other types of architects, people who don't do exactly what it is that we do. Whether if you're an architect, you must implement as though it's a badge of honor, and if you're a tech person, you don't understand business at all. You can't understand your cup of coffee, as you were saying, Paul. Or when and where should you be doing architecture? And I'm a certified ex-architect because I've done a course. And what you find after a while is that these perspectives and the perspectives you read about, often they take a very narrow view. They might be very good at explaining a narrow perspective of architecture. And it's really hard to talk about all of it because it does vary over time and a career. So that's what I want to talk about. Is it possible to talk about architecture across these areas? And I think there are some aspects that you can, some aspects that you can't. But to put it in context, I don't want you to believe anything I say because I certainly don't have the answers. When I was younger, I certainly thought I had all the answers. You come out. I did a PhD in software architecture. I worked for a number of years building applications. I was very vocal, going out and doing conference talks and tweeting and blogging. Thought I knew the answers, but over time, you realize you don't. You just realize how much it is that you do not know about architecture or business or value or technology, different types of technology. So I found when I started reflecting, it's weird that I do not talk about it as much as I used to. And now I'm working in a in a tools company where I have to do research in the industry to help drive our product, and I need to talk about it, which is exciting again. But you have that imposter syndrome. It's surprising. Imposter syndrome is a good thing because it makes you're always questioning how much you actually know and whether you know as much as you think you know. And over time, you realize you don't know as much as you think you know. So I just want you to keep that in mind. This is just one opinion. There may be better ways of capturing it. There may be different aspects of architecture you think are interesting. I'm just going to talk about what it is I've learned by looking back on that career. So this is normally the part in a presentation where the presenter says, this is my definition of architecture, so that they can then go and talk about all the different types. I'm not going to do that, so I've never found one that suits all the different types. There's lots of examples. I'm sure in this conference, there'll be, half of the presentations will have some definition of architecture, but it's also overloaded. It's as though everyone who has a role in industry somewhere that we all work in, if you're not clearly just doing development, or not clearly just doing project management, or not clearly just doing testing, then you put the word architect as a suffix on your role to, it's just the way it's evolved. Even my wife, and I need to be careful what I say, but my wife works as a functional architect, which, back in the day, we used to just call a requirements analyst or a domain expert in development teams. But architect sort of goes into everything. So it's hard to talk about what architecture is, but we have to put a scope on it. So I'm going to use Grady Booch, one, because he's talking at the conference today, and he normally says fantastic stuff about whatever he's talking about. When I started in my career, that was back when object-oriented design was the shiny new thing in the industry. And he had some fantastic sources of information about design, large-scale design and architecture. I could have pulled out another fantastic source when I was starting was Mary Shaw and SEI and CMU, was it? Larger scale systems require larger scale abstractions. All these definitions, the ones that are useful, have something to do with design. We're doing design. Not all types of design are architecture, but there's something about the concept that you're designing that is architecture. And we can say it's the significant design decisions, or the ones, what does Martin Fowler say? The ones you wish you got right at the beginning of the project, or other people say the ones that are hard to refactor later, the ones you have to get right early. It's something about design. So I'm going to talk about design that has to do with architecture and the different types of design that you go through. And all design that I've done and I've seen falls into this pattern somehow. You are sitting in between what we want to do with what is possible to do, and you have a bunch of techniques in your toolbox, and somehow you're synthesizing all that together, not you alone, but you perhaps as a group, but there is a design which takes all these things together. And what you want to do is a combination of the value you want to deliver, or the functionality you want to deliver, or the outcomes, or the emergent qualities, or the ilities, testability and scalability and resilience, and all the other ones. And what is possible to do is all your building blocks. Obviously, if you're working in application architecture, solution architecture, it's technical aspects. But over time, you start working with a bunch of other aspects. You're working with processes and function capabilities and teams. And even, as we'll talk about, you're working with operating models and investment mechanisms and prioritization mechanisms. All these things constrain and create possibilities for what you want to do. And then we have our techniques, of course, methods and patterns and tools and Stack Overflow answers and all the other stuff that you can use to help you understand design, or understand what you want to do in combination with what's possible to do. Now, there's a whole bunch of different types of architecture, and all these you know, some of the ones I showed a few slides ago, and an architect must implement, and you should use, yeah, we've got Simon on next, so you must use C4 to document your architecture, or you're not an architect if you're drawing in PowerPoint. It doesn't make sense when you think about design in this way. In some contexts, they make sense and they're useful things to say, and in other contexts, they don't make sense. It's not helpful to think that way. Also want to point out, and something you alluded to before, Paul, is that the right-hand side and down the bottom, what is possible to do and the techniques, that is like 98% of what people talk about, just to pick a number, a high number. We almost always talk about those things in conference presentations and webinars, and we do certifications in them because they're deterministic. They're the kinds of things you can talk about across context, you know, and we can argue about them and we have lots of in-depth conversations about them, but they're not architecture, right? They're not the design. They're aspects of that feed into it, but they're not design. It's really hard to talk about what we want to do, that part, in a common way, because it is context dependent, you know, the problem you're trying to solve. And the actual synthesis part in the middle, where you're actually sitting together and doing your trade-offs, it's hard to talk about, apart from saying that's where you sit and do your trade-offs, because it is more nebulous. You know, it's more conceptual, it's more ideas. And especially maybe 10, 15 years ago, we were much better talking about this, especially when the patterns movement was a big thing. I think we were much better talking about thinking about design, whereas now a lot of the conversation just focuses on the deterministic parts. You know, what is the building blocks we have, and what are the different techniques? And we get into all sorts of arguments about them. But there's a real danger. If that's all you talk about, then you're in danger of cargo culting. You know, if you don't know the apocryphal story about cargo cults, and that's a great story from, I think it was Steve McConnell's book. But we need to be really careful that we get away from that. We don't get stuck on that, and we talk about actual design. So I'm going to talk a bit about the left-hand side for a second, the business. One of the things that happens when you get a bit of grey hair and you've been in the industry for a while is you end up looking at a lot of CVs, hiring people who want to be architects or senior developers or tech leads or whatever it is that you call the role in your company. And every single one of them, mine included, has some version of, I really enjoy being the link between business and IT. And over, you know, when I started, and I remember when I first put that in my CV, you know, I had a really clear understanding in my head. This is the business, and this is who I help, and this is how I help to do that design synthesis for. But over time, I realized just how little I understood about business. So let's talk about that. And, you know, a really good way to deal with cognitive bias is to think of the opposite situation. So try and imagine that I'm a business analyst, or I'm an expert in a certain part of the business. I don't know, customer support. I'm an expert in customer support. I run a bunch of teams, and I'm dragged into an IT project to build a new solution. And I really enjoy it. Yeah, I'm part of the team where we're developing a solution. We have lots of interesting discussions. We put things into production that helps people. And I say, I really enjoy being the link between business and IT to someone from IT. It'll be really clear to them that I have a really limited understanding of IT, right? What I'm really talking about with IT is just one project or one set of teams that are developing one solution. I have no concept of IT as it works for the entire company. I don't understand IT management and all the budgeting and all the investment decisions they have to make, how they deal with the IT department as a whole and how it's serving the business or working together with the business or divided up into the business in value streams, how they work on education for those people, how they go about hiring and building up the right competencies, how operations occurs. I just had this really narrow scope of what IT is. And the opposite's true as well. When I got started as an architect, I just had this very blinkered view of what business was. And when I say I want to be the link between business and IT, it's normally a really, really tiny part of what it is. And it works both ways. So for technical architects, we often get into the idea that people just want to know how to solve requirements. My job is to explain to you how technology is going to solve your requirements, and often get into an argument about, can't you just please present your requirements to me in a better way? Because I don't understand how it is that they think and work and what they want to do. And even if you're more into the business architect level, often we get stuck in the technology and the techniques. Look at my super fancy meta model of how I want to represent the business, and look at my incredibly detailed process model. But it's not helping the business about what they want to achieve, because I just have this blinkered view of what the business is. So it's one of the biggest things I've had to learn, of going through different types of design. And as we go through different types of design, I want to talk a bit about who is the business, because we keep talking about the business as if it's one thing. And it's not. Again, as you said before, and the tail end of the other presentation, Paul. So we'll start getting into it. And the first thing is there is no top down and bottom up. There is just always these two things feeding each other continuously. As you understand, as you explore different things of what you want to do, it drives you to explore what is possible to do. And the other way around, understanding in detail new things that are possible to do trigger ideas about what you want to do. And you have to go both ways. The architecture role is the role that does that two-way synthesis. Again, we have to say top down and bottom up, because we always think and present our thoughts in a sequential manner. But inside our head, it's not happening sequentially. It's happening in parallel. It's just always mixed up together, and it's hard to separate it. And it doesn't necessarily mean it's the architects that think this way. I've worked with some fantastic people who you would say from the business side, who are very clear about, okay, I must think in terms of what is possible to do. And they're always asking questions. I have this idea. How is it possible to do? What can I do? What can I not do? And it's the same the other way. You tend to find people who come from a strong technical background. Some of them are more inquisitive than others about what they're trying to do. Some people are incredibly focused on technology and techniques, and that's great. We need that kind of competence, that kind of engineering skill. But others drift towards how am I delivering value, and what does value even mean in this context? So it's more of it's not the architecture title, it's the architecture mindset. And it doesn't matter what titles you have and what position you are in the company, you meet many different people who have that mindset, and some that don't. But the key thing here is you have this design concept. You build this concept in your head about architecture. All right, so let's dig into it a bit more. And so I'm going to get into 4 exemplars, right? 4 different examples of types of design that I've been through in my career. Again, not about one is technical architecture or application or business or whatever. It's just, here's different design problems with different types of scale and different types of what they were trying to do and what is possible to do. And most technical architects, I started as a very technical architect, starting in this sort of area. There's not again, these are not categories. There's a continuum of types of problems that you work with, and these are just different points on a continuum to give exemplars. But I started, building applications with different teams. And in this situation, you think, okay, who is the business? Well, the business is normally one person who has a problem, who's trying to help a certain group of users, and you're trying to help them deliver that functionality with your building blocks. So you're trying to understand, what do we want to do? It's this combination of requirements and value. I'm not going to talk about when and how you do the architecture because that evolves over time. But it's more about what is your architecture representing, and it's this synthesis between the building blocks that you can build with and delivering this value and these functional requirements and these non-functional or quality requirements. And the point that you start doing it is normally after an investment decision has been made. Or at least for me, you'd be brought into a project because people say we are going to do this. Someone has decided we're going to do this, but we have to work out how to do it, and we need to realize what it is that we want to do. We want to realize this value. And your job is to think about what is possible to do. And that's, the concepts, the building blocks provided to you by the technology that you're using. So obviously, in order to understand what is possible to do, you should be implementing with that technology. And so when you say an architect should also implement, in this type of architecture, absolutely. You need to understand the technology, you need to understand what you're building with, and that is always changing. The only way to keep up with it is to do. The other thing that you build with, well, it's not so obvious, are the teams, the people doing the work, and how you spread the load across the people. So you might only have one or two teams, and they're generally all pointed in the same direction, which is an easy thing to say now, because as we get further along, we start dealing with when teams are not pointed in the same direction. But generally, you have a problem you're trying to solve together. It is your main priority for you to solve this problem, right? And you work together, and you have all these techniques. So you understand different architecture, maybe design views. You may use C4, you may use UML, you may just be doing boxes and lines on a whiteboard, whatever it is. You may be doing domain-driven design to partition your domain in the beginning. You may be, the very first technique I was using at this stage was CRC cards, which I still use, even at sort of enterprise business level. There's lots of techniques, and they're all about how do I partition my technology, my building blocks, in a way that I can work out how I'm delivering the value, the functionality. All right, but that's the key thing. Sorry, a lot of the opinions about software architecture that we have and that we talk about, we still tweet about, they primarily come from this area. Not exactly this, but around this area, this type of design. When we talk about software architecture, we're often inferring this situation, but they're not the only ones. So we want to talk about different types of technical software architecture. And as a technical architect, you will start potentially going into bigger and bigger problems. You don't have to become a business architect or a PowerPoint architect to do that. You may just get dragged into these other types of situations. So let's have a talk about those. So the next type of problem wasn't building a single application. It was building a solution that went across a lot of applications. So it's really a system of applications. So an example of that, especially for the Europeans, is GDPR. So that was a thing that we all had to go through a few years ago, where you're not just thinking about one application, you're thinking about how does my customer information, my personal identifying information about people and individuals flow through my company, because I need to implement these policy enforcements on them, and I need to show compliance, and I need to be able to delete this data after a certain amount of time. It wasn't just building one application. It was about changing how many different applications work together to deliver a value or a process. So you start to think about what you want to do is not one single application that's easily scoped. It's more of a process that flows through the landscape of applications. And when you think about the business that you work with, it's not a single product owner anymore. You probably have one person who owns the solution. But what you're doing is you're crossing many different applications, which are supporting many different parts of the business that all have their own owners. So suddenly you're dealing with many stakeholders. Yeah? Maybe one owner, but many people who believe they are the owner of parts of it. And that's it's a different type of problem, different type of understanding. So let's talk a bit about what are you trying to build with. You still have technical components, but it's not so much about the technology anymore. It's about distributing a functionality. It's about separation of concern and responsibilities. Clearly, you still deal with those at the application level, but it's different here. It's bigger. It's more distributing across applications. Or, even if you have a microservice-based approach to doing things, you end up grouping them into different domains, much larger domains, and you're going across domains. You tend not to have teams that are 100% aligned. You may organize a project, but there will always be competing demands for resources and time now, because you're trying to do solutions that go across people that are building other things as well. So your constraints, you start having design constraints around teams and their capacity, teams and their ability to communicate with each other, right? How they dedicate themselves to this project, their priorities. You also tend to have a lot more discussion about short and long-term possibilities with the solution. And should we do this in a strategic way? Should we do it in a quick and dirty way? Can we start with this way, but then evolve it over time? And how does that affect things? You can still understand what's possible to do, but it becomes your sole focus. As the person who is responsible, even if you're working as a team, you'll have someone who's responsible for the architecture. It becomes your focus to look across. And I've seen situations where people say, we don't need architects for that. We'll just get the team leads in each of those different applications to work together to do it. And that can work. I've seen it work, and I've seen lots of times where it doesn't work. And it's mostly because people have competing priorities that they have to work with. They have competing things fighting for their attention. I'll come back to that in a second, but if we have a look at the toolbox, you're not just thinking about techniques that have to do with how do you partition technology or how do you deal with different types of frameworks. You start getting into toolboxes for understanding what you want to do. What you want to do is not as well scoped anymore. It's a much larger scope. And you need to start breaking it down. And another part of the problem is the people who are the business, and even in IT, at this scale, it's much harder to understand how the solution works through IT. It's not as visible, it's not as transparent. So a lot of what the techniques are doing, it's more about how do you partition the problem? How do you make it visible? How do you build a shared understanding? From a more technical side, you start thinking more about interactions of things. You start thinking about, okay, am I going to do service invocation? Am I going to do eventing? What's the trade-off? How is data moving through the organization? How do you deal with changes to certain types of data that can get updated in different applications? You have the integration patterns and larger solution architecture patterns, which are great. But the design problem is a different type of design problem. You're still trying to deal with delivering the value, understanding the non-functional requirements, but you have these other problems as well, trying to understand how can I do it in a way that's understandable for people, How can I build that shared understanding? How can I get people to point in the similar direction? Because it's not a given that they're pointed in the same direction. And also you tend to come into the problem earlier in the process. Earlier in the process, it's maybe not decided that we're going to do this project yet, or this thing. It may go across, it'll go across value streams or go across semi-autonomous teams. And so there is always something that goes across. It's impossible to partition your business in a way that every single thing is isolated in the value stream. You can improve it, but there's always something that goes across. And so part of your work is to bring that common direction together. Sell the idea, sell the possibilities, and get people being able to work together. That's part of this as well. It's interesting that once I started working on this, I was doing less development to the point where I was doing no development. And as you work with these kinds of solutions, you work with more and more of them, sometimes in parallel, helping different groups to do this work. And at no point did I ever say, you know what, I don't want to do development anymore. I just want to design systems and tell people what to do. Never happened. And I've never seen it happen to anyone else. But we talk about each other as architects as though it does happen. There's always people who would like to tell other people what to do because people are people. But for the majority of situations I've been in, that hasn't been the problem. The problem has been capacity, time, and the ability to understand our own time capacity and our own mental capacity. You get to the point where in order to understand how things work across applications, you can't be dedicated to one application. And if you are dedicated to one application or set of applications or services, you're so focused on that and all the changes that you have to handle there that you can't fully understand what's happening across. You can participate in a team that does the work, but what I've experienced is that you normally need to have someone who's dedicated to what's going across. Otherwise, you lose knowledge, you lose perspective, you lose understanding of how things work across, and things start to break. You have lots of individual pieces that do their job, but how they all work together stops working. So it's hard. It's really hard at this level because you want to be doing the technical part, and you want to be collaborating with lots of people, and you have to collaborate with all of them. But you end up getting in this area where that becomes your domain. You work across, and you need to have people dedicated to that. If you ask, it's a hard trade-off for ourselves. If you ask any architect or any team or any team lead, you say, do you want to be involved earlier in the process of deciding what we do? Every single one of them puts a hand up and says yes. If you then say, do you want to be involved in more meetings? Every single one of them puts their hand down. Because at this level, you're doing a lot more trying to understand things. It takes a surprising amount of time to build common understanding. So you have to trade off in your career. If you want to keep doing development, it's really hard to dedicate yourself to these kinds of design problems. It's possible to some extent. I'm not saying it's impossible, but you will have to do trade-offs. Okay, so let's go to the next one. So you end up doing a lot of solution architecture, but occasionally you work on much bigger problems. So in my last job, I was working on excuse me. I was working in a multinational telecom across 6 different countries, about 20 different brands and independent business units, subsidiaries. And there was lots of mergers and acquisitions. And the business, you start talking to people like the COO, people in charge of how we operate as a company to do things. Start talking to VPs of different major business areas, people who are in charge of long-term strategy, long-term investment, in the company. And they want to know, as all businesses become more digitized, every single decision has a consequence for what's possible to do. And it's harder for them to make decisions which are independent of, yeah, but how's that going to change IT? So you get into these kinds of discussions, and the value that you're working with is more about how does the company as a whole operate? How do we deliver value in the best possible way? So in the example I had, and you may have similar examples if you've ever been involved in dealing with mergers and acquisitions. You know, I have a CFO who comes and says, why do we, as a company that does basically the same thing across all these countries, have 26 different billing systems with all the CapEx and OpEx associated with that? Why don't we just have one? Which is a fair question for a CFO. And the answer, of course, is it's complicated. Of course, if you were starting from scratch, greenfield, you could build one, but you're not. When you're in these kinds of environments, it is brownfield, and it is perpetual brownfield, as my old boss used to say. And you have to try and understand that. How do I achieve this value? Not just using technology and teams, but a huge landscape of architecture. And when you look at what is possible to do, the size of the problem gets to a point where it's really hard to understand it all. You know, you're dealing with, maybe if you've joined a few different companies and each one has 500 or 600 applications or thousands of services and, you know, many thousands of employees. And you say, well, what should we do? Just the size of the problem is enormous, and it's really hard to understand it. So you have to think, how far can I go to try and help deliver this value, knowing that it's really hard to get all the different people needed to work together. Everyone is going in their own direction. It's not just one or two teams or business units anymore. Everyone has what they're measured on, and they're going in their direction as fast as they possibly can. And you're trying to pull them into the same direction. So it's really hard to understand and say we should do this, because you don't know. You need to try and break the problem down. You need to try and analyze it. And the other things you get to build with, you're not just building with solutions. There's lots of different solutions and applications. You're not just building with teams. Here you have to understand what it is that motivates teams. You have to understand what motivates people who own solutions. They become part of your building blocks as well. You know, you have to understand investment mechanisms, because it's not just, it's a tool that you need to make use of. You need to understand the investment mechanisms, prioritization mechanisms. Even if you have the utopia of value streams, all broken up into value streams, and everyone has their own backlog and everyone has their own investment and they're driving their own change, there's always prioritization issues. There's always things that go across teams or value streams or release trains or whatever you call it. And there's always more things to do than there is capacity to do it. So there's always, how do you prioritize, and how do you get through the prioritization process so that you can get things going in your direction? So they become part of your toolbox. And as an architect, there's not a lot of help here. You know, it's hard to understand this stuff. It's hard to teach because there's not much codified knowledge. It's hard to test because you don't get into these situations every day. You kind of deal with it in one company, and then maybe you go somewhere else. It's hard to share the pain. But there are techniques that you can do to help analyze. You get into more socio-technical techniques. How do people and solutions work together to solve problems? You start dealing with those kinds of issues, and there are some techniques there. They're hard to use if you're a technical architect. There are lots of, let's say, business architecture techniques, which are great for analysis, but that's not the design part. You know, often these Often these business architecture techniques, they're very good at what we want to do, breaking down strategies, understanding business units, goals, long-term and short-term. They're really bad at understanding what's possible to do because they're independent of what's actually implemented at the company. You know, you get, if you've ever had the joy of working with management consultants that come in and help with what we want to do, it's impossible for someone to come in from outside a company and understand how it really works in practice. You know, so you, even as a technical architect, your value is enormous. If you can help work together with people who are very good at understanding business and strategy and execution, but helping them understand what is possible to do and being part of that design team. And I think more and more CEOs, COOs, especially progressive organizations, people that have been digital, for lack of a better term, for a long time, they understand the importance of this. You know, if you like Simon Wardley and his tweet storms that he has, he often talks about how it can be more beneficial to take an engineer and teach them about management than take a manager and try and teach them about technology or teach them to be an engineer. But it goes the other way as well. Both myself and things I've experienced, you often underestimate the competence level of people that we call the business. You know, they're very good at what they do. They have long experience, far longer than us. And sometimes we fall into the trap of trying to tell them how to do their job. You know, all these suggestions about how people should organize so that IT can be best, without always understanding what it is that they're trying to do and how can we perhaps adapt more to meet what they're trying to do. Anyway, other types of techniques, cost of delay and especially opportunity cost. They're really interesting because often if you have a purely technical focus, you know, you will say, this is the kind of solution we need to have, and this is how much this solution will cost, and this is how long it will take, and these are all the technical aspects. Maybe the most common question I ever got from VPs and COOs was, what are we not going to do while we're doing that thing that you think is so great with technology? That's what they care about, you know, delivering value out, delivering the long-term plans of the business. So you always need to think, okay, it's not just what is the technical aspect, but the bigger picture of the entire company, it has an impact on that. What is the trade-off I'm making in terms of things that will not be delivered while I'm arguing for the thing that I would like to have delivered? All right. Maybe lately in the last 5 years, I've seen more architects get involved with how we organize work, the system that builds the system. Maybe this is perhaps the mirror aspect to the last one. So the last, you know, system of systems is all about our, to use some safe terminology, say the operational value streams. And this is more about the development value streams, how you get the work done. I know it's not good to separate like that, but there are differences. And more architects get more involved in how do we become an agile organization? How do we scale the work? And the business that you work with, the people that are invested in this, they're the people responsible for producing the change, responsible for delivering the change, the COO, the CIO especially, or if you don't have a COO, the VPs that have a similar responsibility. I can see I left out one of my bullet points. I'll try and do the to-do now. What they're trying to achieve is continuous change. So you're thinking about how do we design our system that builds the system so it is delivering change in the best possible way. So we talk about value streams, we talk about domains, we talk about project to product. We talk about how can we do beyond budgeting? How can we get away from projects and get into investing in capabilities that deliver strategies over a certain period of time? Trying to do that at scale is hard because often, you know, we talk about the techniques, we talk about the building blocks, but trying to apply it at scale is a hard thing to do. You know, I'd like to think that I have an agile mindset. So when I started working in these types of problems, I was very much of the, yeah, no projects and no estimates, and we shouldn't be using SAFe because it's just, certified agile, and it doesn't show that you have the mindset. But then you try and get 3,000 people pointed in the same direction with the same mindset. That's really hard. You need something that you can all rally around. Even if you understand the limitations of it, having a technique and a framework to do this can just help provide that, to say ubiquitous language that we all enjoy from DDD. Just doing that at this scale has such a profound effect on getting people pointed in the same direction. And then as the next step, you're doing your continuous improvement. It's less about the water scrum fall or the fake agile at scale, and it's more about understanding how we can get better and better and better. There are techniques, of course. We talk about reverse Conway from a sociology perspective, to try and think about open systems. So moving from command and control type understanding in a business to understanding how can we split up our team so that they're cross-functional. How do we split up teams that work on a capability continuous over a long period of time to deliver value? Of course, we have things like team topologies. We have different frameworks for disciplined and scaled agile. They're all things we have in our toolbox. But again, sometimes we get too deep into the let's implement this technique, let's implement this theory or this framework, and not about how do we make use of that technique and framework to deliver what it is we want to do, which is more about driving through continuous change without having centralized coordination, which slows down the process. Maybe also we go a bit too far in how far we think it can go, because there will always be a need to do something centrally, because you have to coordinate, things have to work across, and things always have to be prioritized. All right, so that's the 4 different types of systems. Very quickly, we see trends in our discipline about moving away from the centralized architect and moving into architecture as a facilitator across teams. And there are many different buzzwords for how you do this, but they're all trying to get to the same thing. How do we democratize architecture? And what does that mean for what I've just been talking about, the different types of design? So I want to come back to this. If I try and think about what is it about design that works across all these different types of architecture, then quoting Fred Brooks is always a good thing. So if you're in your, if you're starting a career, I can give you a tip. Always quote Fred Brooks if you can, for 2 reasons. One, because people who are more experienced will nod sagely and say, oh yes, Fred Brooks, that person knows what they're talking about. But mostly because there's so much depth in the stuff that he writes about in design, and he says it in very simple ways, but you can use it at many different levels of understanding. And the key thing I found in all the different types of design, from application or technical architecture to designing businesses after acquisitions, is conceptual integrity. There's this, it's hard to explain, and I can't put it in a book, and I can't give you a step-by-step instruction for how to get there, but there's something about you build an understanding of how what you want to do is delivered by what is possible to do, and it's logically consistent and it's cohesive, which is just a fancy way of saying all the bits make sense and they work together in a standard way. There's no gaps, and it delivers what you want. And that's what you're trying to do, not as a single person. It's not saying it has to be one person that does it. You want to do it as a group, and you're always doing it in collaboration, but it has to look as though it comes out of one mind. And I've been in organizations where every single architect was sacked because a new CTO came in. They said, all we need is development teams. They will work together and they'll figure it out. And it just turned into a mess because how the company worked together lacked conceptual integrity. So they had to do a big rehiring policy 2 years later. And of course, there's many architects that are maybe not so good, and maybe they get in the way, and maybe they take too big a responsibility and they don't collaborate enough. But you have to create this conceptual integrity. Everything has to make sense, how it all works together, whether you're thinking about a single application or whether you're thinking about the company as a whole or many different companies working together. It has to fit together. So if there's one thing I'll leave you with, it's this. It's conceptual integrity. I wish I could give you a way of step-by-step producing it. But the only way I've seen it happening is to actually sit and work and solve problems, work together with other architects, and you just build this way of thinking to say that doesn't quite work. And as I said, I've never seen a good definition of software architecture. The only place I've seen something useful, and I apologize for the wall of text, is when we start getting into philosophy of science. So how do people understand and solve problems? And you don't have to read this, but the gist of it is there is only ever continuous trying to understand what is possible together with what you want to do. And it's not just IT architecture. It is all types of problem solving. You try and understand. Always takes time, and you will always get a deeper and more sophisticated understanding of both things as you work with it. And you just have to work with it and work with it and work with it. Again, whether you're talking about technical single application or whether you're dealing with many hundreds of applications and how they work together to deliver a strategy over 10 years. So I'll leave it at that. There's many different types of architecture. If you don't follow Ruth Malin, you definitely should do so. She has an enormous, fantastic source of information. But we are many different types of architects, and we should be better at understanding what each of us does and working together in a better way. That's it, Paul.
I love the brief pause while I turn on all my devices, right? Wow, first of all, amazing presentation. I want to thank Ardok and you for supporting us. So just get that out there.
Thanks, man.
Really love, we've spent 20 years at the Iasa having these debates with communities all over the world, and I feel like honestly, there's a few of us that have been, involved in those communities that have seen it from so many perspectives, lived it from so many angles, that really see a number of the different things that come up. So, and I think you really hit on a few of them, especially noticeable things like techniques, right? Oh, this technique. I kind of think about it as design patterns. Back when I still write code, but I still use design patterns. And so that was a really amazing component. You had kind of catalog techniques, which is a lot what we've done in the BIL-T, as well as including things like one thing you mentioned was the cost of what not to do, which is often called real options pricing in like MBA circles, which you obviously already know about. But I guess I have a question for you. There's a number of really long kind of statements in here that were a little bit about Iasa, but we had one question. Let's see. First, the result of the toolbox of techniques. Does anybody care? Should the architect adopt what developers are being hit by, delivering minimum viable product, or iterations? What are the challenges and the contradictions? I think that's a complex question, but I'll give it to you the way it was written.
Oh, thanks. Okay, I mean, it's hard, right? It's hard. There's no easy answer to these things. What everyone, the whole industry has learned is it's much better to deliver value slowly and evolve, because your understanding evolves over time. And trying to think about every possibility at the start is impossible. At the same time, you don't want to make decisions that you can't back out of. You don't want to make decisions that are hard to refactor. And all I can say is it comes with experience. There's no, here is the first, second, and third thing you should check. I'll just say you need to design a lot of solutions to many different types of problems. You need to collaborate with many different types of architects. go out with your team. I haven't seen so many lately, but it used to be popular to do architecture katas in conferences and workshops. Just solve different types of problems, because you start to build up a gut feel for where the right level of intensity is with your architecture work as you go.
So I'm going to ask you a question myself, because you said something that really struck home. My mom was a VP of HR, which I think everybody on this call would agree is treated as the business. And this is one of my big sticking points, is I always say the business, because there's no such thing as the business. The business, if it were anything, is either the stockholders or the owner. That's the only people that could be considered the business, right? Everybody else just works for the business, just like me, or even if I'm a consultant. So I mean, so again, my mom was a VP of HR, but she didn't have a college degree, right? So she worked her way there. She was SHRM certified, which is a Human Resources Association. Just to reaffirm your point, it didn't mean she didn't do a amazing job for the companies. My question is really, when are we going? In your opinion, what do you think about when you stop having to think about not what is architecture, but what can I accomplish, right? I mean, you put a lot of stuff in there. What are the possibilities? What do you find is very architectural about that thinking pattern for you personally in a minute and a half? I mean, just a summary of your kind of like, when you get out of the what is architecture and why is architecture important, and just start being an architect for someone, what are you doing?
It is that last enormous wall of text I did from Karl Popper, which says there's something going on in your head where you're looking at what you want to do and you're constantly testing it with what is possible to do. And in your head, you're saying, let's try that approach. Is it working? What are the consequences? Oh, that doesn't work. I need to think through something else. Or when you're working together at a whiteboard with other people and you're interacting, you're bouncing ideas off each other, which is always, okay, if we think about it like this, how would it work? If we're thinking about it like this, how would it work? What are the consequences of it doing this way? Can we live with those trade-offs? Yes or no? That process of going through it, where you're thinking about the problem and it drives, you're testing out the concept in your head about how you solve it, and how you test the idea in your head pushes you back into the problem to say, I need to look at that problem deeper. Maybe there's some other aspect, which is really one of the key things I need to solve. The ability to do that, whether you have architect in your title or not, some people are really good at it, and it just seems to be natural to them to think that way. That's the architecture mindset, and whether you're a head VP of HR, I've seen VPs, I've seen CEOs who dig deep into the details about how does that work? What if it was changed a little bit that way? They just have that way of thinking. And I've seen people with architect in their title that cannot do that and should not be doing that, right? So it's not about your title and your training. Often it's just this way of thinking, putting it all together.
I'd like to remind the audience that this is the only, if you believe that architecture is a profession, it would be the only profession you can be nominated into by your boss, right? Meaning, like, the CEO of a hospital can't just pick a janitor and go, oh, guess what? You're a surgeon now. Like, it's not legal to do that, right? So we live in a world where anybody can put it on their business card. I can quit my job and say I'm an architect and try to go get a job as an architect, right? So the variability of the title itself, but like you said, competencies of architects, those are measurable. We have 3,000 competency surveys, and they come back the same way. They're predictable. Competency growth is predictable. But like you, I got sticker shock when I first realized what kind of I had the imposter syndrome constantly when I realized what architects know and what we have to continuously know to be able to stay abreast of change, to be able to grow in our career. Like I said, I hope you'll join us on, you will also join us on Bitterbuck, because I think you've got a great view of what we're doing, the techniques we use. I want to come check with you. Like, hey, wait, what about that thing? We don't. Where do we do that? But anyway, it was a great presentation. Got to get over to our next presenter. So thank you so much, Jason.
Thanks, Paul.